Hey guys, today we're diving into the history they sanded smooth and hung on Halloween decorations. We're talking about witches. Specifically, medieval witches. Forget the pointy hats, the bubbling cauldrons, the questionable dental hygiene cackling over a brew. Everything you think you know about history's most maligned figures is probably wrong. They weren't casting spells from fairy tale books or attending midnight gatherings on broomsticks, though that myth would come later, and the truth behind that is far more disturbing than any story Grimm ever told. We need to uncover what medieval people were actually afraid of when they whispered the word witch, because it wasn't magic in the way we understand it now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready for history's most disturbing truth. Seriously, this isn't a cozy history lesson. It's a window into the kind of primal fear that makes communities turn on themselves. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the time so we know where the truth is spreading. Now dim the lights and prepare to discover why the trees are watching, and they're not on your side. In the muck and gloom of the early Middle Ages, the greatest fear wasn't some spectral figure dancing with the devil. It was the woman next door. It was the blight on your crops after an argument with Old Man Hemlock. It was the milk souring the day after your refused widow made a few eggs. These weren't grand, theatrical curses. These were petty, mundane acts of malice magnified by superstition and fear. The witch wasn't a powerful sorceress. She was the inconvenient person you blamed when life went inevitably, horribly wrong. Your child fell ill, witchcraft. Your cow died, witchcraft. The weather turned foul, definitely witchcraft. The fear was deeply personal, woven into the fabric of daily struggle and survival. It wasn't about pacts with unseen forces. It was about tangible harm, the kind that meant starvation or a winter without warmth. They didn't fear magic itself. They feared the very human capacity for spite weaponized by belief. Consider the actual accusations from early court rolls, sparse as they are before the panic set in. It wasn't flying or attending sabbats. It was malefice, simply doing harm, causing impotence, spoiling ale, making someone trip and break a leg. Small-scale, nasty business. The power wasn't in a wand or ancient tome. It was in the whispered word, the evil eye, the belief that a vengeful heart could somehow manifest misfortune. This was the root terror, the idea that your neighbor's ill will could physically destroy your life. It was the ultimate passive aggression, weaponized by widespread anxiety and ignorance. They weren't riding brooms over the treetops. They were walking the same muddy paths as you. Their alleged weapon wasn't a spellbook. It was the very air around them, thick with suspicion and the kind of bad luck you couldn't pray away. And dealing with this perceived threat, well, that involved methods that make the devil seem downright merciful. So your neighbor's cow died and everyone looked at Agnes. What happened next wasn't a trial by jury. It was a trial by God, or more accurately, a trial designed by men hoping God would sort out their paranoid mess. Forget courtroom dramas. Justice for alleged witchcraft in the early days often involved dunking. The thinking went, pure water, being a divine element, would reject evil. So if you were thrown into a body of water tied up, well, if you floated, the water rejected you, proof you were evil, a witch. If you sank, well, the water accepted you, proof you were innocent. Let that sink in. The test for innocence was drowning. You either floated and were burned, or you sank. And if they were quick enough, maybe they pulled you out before you died. Congratulations, you're innocent and soaking wet. Often, they weren't quick enough. It was a grim, absurd paradox wrapped in religious dogma. The process itself was simple and brutally efficient. Tie the accused hand to foot, often left thumb to right thumb to left toe. Say a prayer, heave them in. The rough rope cutting into flesh, the sudden shock of cold water stealing breath. Silence. Then the verdict, delivered by buoyancy or lack thereof. This wasn't about evidence. This wasn't about intent. It was a rigged game of physics and fear. The stakes escalated from a spoiled batch of beer to a life dependent on whether your density allowed you to sink before you drowned. And the authorities, whether local lords or fearful priests, sanctioned it. This divine judgment was just state-sanctioned murder with extra steps and a prayer. It cemented the idea that fear, not justice, ruled. But as the years crawled by, the fear mutated. It wasn't enough to test if the water accepted them. The very idea of what a witch was began to change, and this new definition, this new terror, would make the water ordeal look like a gentle bath. Right, drowning was one thing, a horrible, fatal coin flip, but it still treated witchcraft as something you did, an action causing a tangible, earthly harm, a really malicious neighbor using bad vibes as a weapon. But fear, like a nasty mold, grows in the dark. It needed a grander villain, a more terrifying narrative. And the church, ever eager to define good and evil for the masses, provided one. The big shift happened slowly, like a shadow creeping across a field. Theologians, particularly from the 13th century onwards, started pondering demons and their influence with obsessive detail. Suddenly, witchcraft wasn't just petty harm, it was heresy. The idea emerged that true witchcraft required a pact, an explicit, signed-in-blood agreement with the devil himself. This transformed the alleged witch from a local nuisance into an enemy of God, an agent of ultimate evil. You weren't just herding crops, you were actively working to overthrow divine order. Why this sudden promotion for the village witch? Because defining witchcraft as heresy served a purpose. Heresy was the ultimate crime, punishable by the full, terrifying might of the church. It allowed religious authorities, particularly the emerging inquisitors, to step in. This wasn't just secular law anymore. This was about saving your soul, by torturing you into confessing you'd sold it. Think about the sheer power grab. Accusations of simple harm could be handled by local courts. But a pact with Lucifer, that was Rome's business. It centralized fear, turning local anxieties into a continental purge. The stakes rocketed from losing your life in a pond to eternal damnation, and the agony of earthly judgment designed to extract confessions for crimes that were, essentially, theological constructs. This new definition required proof, of course. You couldn't just dunk someone for having a bad aura anymore. You needed evidence of the pact, of midnight meetings, of vile rituals. Evidence that didn't exist because the crime itself was a fantasy born of fear and doctrine. And how do you get someone to confess to a fantasy? Well, they had methods. Methods that made drowning seem like a mercy. You needed proof of the devil pact. And since Satan rarely offered signed testimonials or showed up for depositions, the only way to get that proof was from the accused themselves. This is where things stopped being merely grim and started becoming inventively horrific. The inquisitors and later secular courts weren't seeking truth. They were seeking confirmation of a predetermined narrative. Confession was the only currency. And they had sophisticated, soul-crushing ways to extract it. The rack, the strappado, thumb screws, leg vices, tools designed not to kill outright, but to inflict unimaginable pain, to break the body until the mind surrendered and offered whatever words the torturer wanted to hear. Imagine the damp, echoing chambers, the smell of sweat, fear, and something coppery, the rhythmic creak of wood, the groan of tightening rope, or the sharp crack of bone under pressure. It wasn't quick or clean. It was a process of systematic deconstruction, pulling a person apart muscle by muscle, joint by joint. The goal was not just physical agony, but mental collapse. To make death seem like a blissful escape from the promise of more pain. Sleep deprivation, starvation, forced standing, These were less dramatic than the rack, but just as effective at eroding will and blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. A broken person desperate for the pain to stop will agree to anything. Yes, I met the devil. Yes, I signed his book. Yes, I flew through the air. Yes, I turned invisible. Whatever you say, just stop. And here's the truly insane part, the grim irony that curdles the blood. These confessions, extracted under duress that would make a statue weep, were considered valid, legitimate legal evidence. They weren't seen as the ravings of torture victims. They were proof of demonic influence, or worse, proof the devil was giving them the strength to resist confessing, which justified more torture. Your only way out was to lie and die quickly, or tell the truth they wanted and die quickly anyway. The stakes. From a ruined crop to losing your life, your dignity, your sanity, and having your name forever attached to acts of vile heresy you never committed. This factory of pain didn't just produce confessions. It produced the very mythology of witchcraft that would terrorize Europe for centuries. Because the things people confessed to under torture. Well, they weren't just saying they blighted a field anymore. They were starting to describe impossible things, like flying. And what did people confess to when their bodies were being systematically dismantled? They confessed to meeting the devil, yes. They confessed to renouncing Christ, of course. But they also started describing impossible things. Things straight out of nightmares, things no one had accused the village witch of before. Suddenly, confessions weren't just about blighting crops or cursing livestock. They were about gathering in remote places at night. They were about feasting with demons. They were about shape-shifting into animals. And yes, they were about flying. How did the image of a witch flying on a broomstick or a staff or even the back of a demon enter the narrative? Part of it came from folk beliefs, perhaps about nocturnal spirits or ecstatic rituals misinterpreted, but a huge bloody part came from the torture chamber itself. Imagine the scene. A person broken by pain, desperate to please their tormentors, latching onto any suggestion, any question, and weaving it into their desperate confession. Did you fly? Yes, yes, I flew. Tell me how I flew. There was also talk of unguent or salves. Some folk remedies or concoctions might contain substances with psychoactive properties, perhaps causing strange sensations or hallucinations. When an accused person mentioned using such a salve, maybe for aches, maybe for something else entirely, the inquisitors interpreted it through their demonic lens. This must be the flying salve, the devil's grease. It became proof of their impossible journeys. This wasn't ancient pagan practice surfacing. This was a terrifying new mythology being forged in real time, hammered out of pain, fear, and the fevered interpretations of demonologists. These fantastical confessions, however extracted, became the new blueprint for what a witch was. And this blueprint demanded not just individual trials, but a full-scale war. The stakes went from punishing an individual neighbor to identifying and destroying an entire invisible army supposedly in league with Satan. Because if they were meeting, if they were flying, if they were shape-shifting, they weren't just isolated threats anymore. They were an organized conspiracy. So the confessions under torture didn't just create the image of flying witches, they created the fear of a conspiracy. If one woman confessed to meeting others at a midnight Sabbat, then logic, twisted by terror, dictated that there must be others. Many others hiding in plain sight. The dam broke in the late 15th century. Before that, accusations were relatively sporadic, localized. But the combination of the new theological definition, heresy, packed with devil, the methods of torture, producing fantastical confessions, and crucially, the invention of the printing press created a perfect storm. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, first published in 1487, became horrifyingly popular bestsellers. This wasn't some obscure text. It was a widely circulated manual for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. It codified the new mythology, the pact, the sabbats, the impossible acts. It provided justification and instruction for the coming terror. It was essentially a step-by-step guide to mass hysteria. This wasn't the isolated suspicion of a neighbor anymore. This was an official, often state-sanctioned campaign. The hunt was on. It spread like wildfire across Europe, fanned by preachers, judges, and the chilling power of print. Whole villages could be swept up in panic, neighbor turning on neighbor, driven by fear. Greed, the accused's property was often confiscated, and the sheer, overwhelming pressure to name names under torture. The stakes escalated yet again. It wasn't just your life at risk if accused. It was potentially your families, your friends, anyone you could be coerced into naming. The water ordeal seems almost quaint compared to the industrial-scale fear and death that followed. Because the hunt for the devil's recruits required ever more bodies, ever more confessions, and ever more impossible crimes. So the confessions under torture gave them names, names of supposed accomplices, and those names fueled the engine of destruction. Each broken body on the rack, each desperate whisper of a name was fuel for the fire. The hunt wasn't just about finding witches, it was about creating them. The process was a horrifyingly efficient machine. Accuse someone, torture them until they confess and name accomplices, then go arrest those named and repeat the process. It was a chain reaction of terror, powered by pain and fear. Proof wasn't necessary. Accusation was enough to get you into the interrogation chambers. And once you were in, the only way out was confession, which almost always meant death, but slightly faster than enduring more torture. What counted as evidence? A birthmark, a mole called a witch mark. The testimony of enemies, neighbors with grudges, or even children coerced by authorities. Any misfortune could be retroactively linked back to an accused individual's alleged actions. The scale of this wasn't petty local squabbles anymore. Across Europe, over 2 centuries, estimates range into the tens of thousands. Some scholars even suggest hundreds of thousands of people executed. Not just women, though they were the primary targets, but men, children, even animals accused of being familiars. This wasn't justice, it was a purge. The grim irony hangs heavy as ash in the air. The authorities, in their desperate attempt to cleanse society of an imaginary conspiracy, became the most destructive force imaginable. They didn't just punish individuals. They systematically dismantled communities, incentivized betrayal, and created the very chaos they claimed to be fighting against. The hunt wasn't just for witches. It was a hunt that produced witches on paper, soaked in blood and lies. The stakes were no longer just your own life, but the lives of anyone you knew, anyone you had a disagreement with, anyone whose name might pass your lips under unbearable pressure. The hunt created its own reality, a nightmare world where accusation equaled guilt and survival meant condemning others. But even as the fires burned and the lists grew, something started to shift. The very excesses of the hunt. They began to sow seeds of doubt. Right, so the fires burned, the ropes strained, and the water swallowed, but the promises extracted under torture became too wild, too numerous. People confessed to flying to the moon, to turning into cats, to having sex with demons so frequently it defied basic biology. The machine was producing too many impossible truths. The sheer scale became grotesque. When hundreds were being accused in single regions, including children and respected citizens, the narrative started to fray. It became hard to reconcile the image of a vast, invisible army of Satanists with the reality of frail old women and terrified teenagers being hauled into dungeons. Some judges, some officials, began to feel a chilling unease. Was this truly justice or something else entirely? Think of the sheer logistics of these alleged sabbats, 1,000 supposedly meeting in secret locations, flying across vast distances. Even the most fervent believer had to wonder quietly if the confessions extracted with bone-shattering pressure were perhaps unreliable. Some brave souls, like Dr. Johann Weyer in the late 16th century, began to argue that these accused weren't powerful agents of evil, but melancholics deluded by the devil without a formal pact. This subtly undercut the heresy charge. Later, men like Reginald Scott published outright attacks on the idea of witchcraft itself, questioning the evidence, the methods, and the very possibility of the crimes. These were dangerous arguments to make, as they risked being accused of witchcraft themselves, or at least of heresy for denying the devil's power. The grim irony is that the witch hunt didn't end because everyone suddenly became enlightened and rational. It ended, or at least drastically slowed, because it became unsustainable. The legal system choked on the sheer volume of cases and the blatant inconsistencies. The economic costs were ruinous. The social fabric was tearing apart as fear consumed communities. The machine was too efficient at killing, and eventually there weren't enough people left who weren't either dead, accused, or doing the accusing. The stakes shifted from proving guilt to justifying the horrifying process itself. The hunt began to devour its own logic, but even as the physical fires died down, the embers of fear glowed on. Because while they stopped hunting witches in the same way, the idea of the hidden enemy, the secret cabal working against society, that idea was just getting started. The mass executions waned through the late 17th and 18th centuries. Courts grew more skeptical, intellectuals dismissed the more outlandish claims, and the sheer cost in lives and social stability became undeniable. The era of the Great Witch Hunt, a nightmare forged from theology, torture, and printing presses, was drawing to a close. But the end of the hunt wasn't the end of the fear, it simply morphed. The core idea established during the panic, that there exists a hidden, malevolent group meeting in secret, plotting against the established order, possessing forbidden knowledge or power, identifiable only by subtle signs or forced confessions, didn't disappear. It became a template. This blueprint for paranoia, perfected during the witch trials, would be dusted off and applied to new scapegoats. Freemasons, Jesuits, Jews, immigrants, communists, globalists, the identity of the secret enemy changed with the anxieties of the age, but the underlying structure of the fear remained chillingly consistent with the witch hunt narrative. Secret meetings, hidden agendas, manipulation of events from the shadows, loyalty to a power beyond the state or common good. Sound familiar? The witch trials gave us more than just a spooky costume. They institutionalized the idea that a terrible, hidden threat is always lurking, and that extreme measures are justified to root it out. They taught us that fear, when given official sanction and a compelling narrative, can turn neighbors into hunters and logic into a death sentence. The belief in flying to sabbats under the devil's command might have faded, but the fear of the secret society planning your downfall, that's a legacy that still thrives. So, while medieval witches weren't the broom-riding figures of folklore from the start, the hunt to define and destroy them created that image, alongside a far more insidious and enduring weapon. The fear of the unseen enemy, an enemy we're still looking for today, often in the same terrified, illogical ways.